This is Krista Michener. Welcome back to Made to Be Whole. Today we're going to be starting a 3-episode series on diabetes management, and practical things you can do to take control of your health. Stay tuned. Made to Be Whole is intended for informational purposes only. It's not intended to replace the advice or care of a licensed healthcare professional. Participating in this podcast does not constitute a provider-patient relationship with Krista Michener, AHP Integrative Health, or any of the guests featured on Made to Be Whole. Krista Michener, AHP Integrative Health, and any featured guests aren't responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from use of information obtained in this podcast or associated materials. Please consult a healthcare professional for any health-related concerns that you are experiencing. Welcome back. We're going to start a conversation about diabetes. This is something that we could spend a year talking about, trying to understand the science, dispelling myths, answering questions. But what I'm going to start with this week is a summary of a book that really drove this series. And the guest that we're going to have on the next episode is the one who introduced me to the book and used this information to turn his life and health around. The book is called The Diabetes Code by Dr. Jason Fung, who's a physician in Canada. I highly recommend because he does a fantastic job helping everyone understand why this is relevant, even if you don't have diabetes, and understanding the science of it and taking the politics of it out. I wanted to start by reading what he says in the book about the implications of diabetes, because I think in order to pay attention, you need to understand why it matters and the impact that it can have on your health, and why it matters to pay attention sooner rather than later in the disease process if you or a family member's been diagnosed, or better yet, preventing yourself from getting there, because this is endemic in our country. So he says, under the headline here, treat the cause, not the symptoms. Whereas most diseases are limited to a single organ system, diabetes affects every organ in multiple ways. As a result, it is the leading cause of blindness. It is the leading cause of kidney failure. It is the leading cause of heart disease. It is the leading cause of stroke. It is the leading cause of amputations. It is the leading cause of dementia. It is the leading cause of infertility. It is the leading cause of nerve damage. So those are some pretty big things, and I have a hard time believing there is anyone listening here who has not been impacted personally or someone close to them by blindness or kidney failure or amputation or dementia or stroke or infertility or nerve damage. Those are all some pretty compelling reasons to pay attention. But then he poses this question, which I think is really, really critical. But the perplexing question is why these problems are getting worse, not better, even centuries after the disease was first described. As our understanding of diabetes increases, we expect that complications should decrease, but they don't. If the situation is getting worse, then the only logical explanation is that our understanding and treatment of type 2 diabetes is fundamentally flawed. So I think that is super, super compelling. When we live in an era where we have many more quote unquote advances in diabetes treatment, where you have new diabetes drugs being released all the time, why is it that we still have higher rates of diabetes and higher rates of complications of diabetes? The myth that he dispels in this book is that our medical community, pharmaceutical industry is feeding us, if you can get the blood sugar under control, then you're not going to have complications. But diabetes isn't actually a problem of blood sugar metabolism, but a problem of insulin metabolism. So there are two types of diabetes mellitus. So diabetes can be used to describe other diseases like diabetes insipidus, but the diabetes we're talking about that's commonly associated with the high blood sugar that most people are concerned about, that type 1s take insulin for, and all these meds are made for, is diabetes mellitus. And there's type 1 and type 2. Type 1 has also been called insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus or juvenile diabetes, because typically it was just diagnosed in childhood. but we're going to call it type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is related to an actual lack of insulin in the body, that the pancreas actually does not produce adequate amounts of insulin. And it's a life threatening, terrifying disease that used to cause children to waste away and die. And the discovery of insulin was an absolutely life changing, life saving, life altering thing for people who had type 1 diabetes. But that is a very different mechanism of action than type 2 diabetes, which is the type that is becoming much, much more prevalent, that all of this drug development is targeted toward. It's insulin resistance and it is acquired. So, insulin in the context of type 1 diabetes is a very important critical part of treatment. But in the context of type 2 diabetes, you don't have a deficiency of insulin. What you have is this cycle. When you have too much sugar in your diet, then over time, your body kind of wears out. It becomes insulin resistant. So you eat something sweet, your blood sugar goes up, and then your body compensates by pumping out more insulin to bring the sugar down. That's an oversimplification, but it's kind of the essence of it. So at the most basic understanding, you can just say the part wore out. It get tired of firing insulin to keep up with these rising levels of blood sugar. But it's really a cycle that's created. You have too much insulin because of elevated blood sugar. And so then that creates a fatty liver, and fatty liver creates insulin resistance. And because of that, your body is pumping out more insulin to try to compensate for the insulin resistance, which causes worsening fatty liver, which causes more insulin. And so it just becomes this very, very vicious cycle. And one thing that I think is important to note in disease progression, that the pattern of insulin resistance begins 10 years before the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. So I am going to read what Dr. Fung said about this and why insulin is not the best intervention for type 2 diabetes. Type 1s have to use some amount of insulin because their body does not produce it. But insulin as a treatment for type 2 diabetes is pretty flawed because it can reverse the hyperglycemia. So that means high blood sugar. In medicine, anytime you hear hyper, it means high. So think the hyperactive kid, high activity, go, 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 go. So hyperglycemia, high blood sugar, but it doesn't reverse the effects of hyperinsulinemia, too much insulin. In fact, it's feeding that problem, and that drives the complications that arise. So you can have someone with improved blood sugar control, but who still has all of these complications because we're feeding more insulin to them through medical interventions that worsens the effects. So here was his summary of what it does. Higher insulin doses only create more insulin resistance, even while the symptom of high blood glucose improves. So this is key. High blood glucose is actually the symptom, not the disease. It's the high insulin level or hyperinsulinemia that eventually leads to insulin resistance and what causes the complications. Even while the symptom of high blood glucose improves with higher insulin doses, the disease of type 2 diabetes worsens. Insulin doesn't actually eliminate glucose from the body. It shoves the excess glucose out of the blood and forces it into the cells. Somewhere, anywhere. The eyes, the kidney, the nerve, the heart. Over time, all organs simply start rotting from too much glucose. Using medicines like insulin to hide the blood glucose in the tissues of the body is ultimately destructive. The key to proper treatment of type 2 diabetes is to get rid of the excess sugar, not just move it around the body. The problem then is too much glucose and too much insulin. So let's break that down a little bit. High blood glucose is what we can measure. That's what the little finger sticks are for. That's why You check the hemoglobin A1C, which is looking at average blood glucose levels over the previous 3 months. That's why sometimes people wear these continuous glucose monitors that can give them constant information about their levels of blood glucose. But that is actually just a symptom and it's what we can measure. And when we give insulin to try to treat that, that glucose doesn't disappear. It has to go somewhere, kind of like the law of conservation of mass is the law of conservation of blood glucose. I made that up. If it's wrong, sue me. If it's right, you heard it here first, and maybe I'll be famous one day. But the law of conservation of glucose. So insulin says, get out of here. You cannot be in the blood anymore. So it gets driven to the other organs. And then that's what causes all of these complications. Your organs, basically, in his analogy here, start to rot over time because you have the accumulation of all of this glucose in places where it doesn't belong. So, if insulin is a problem, why are so many of the treatments that we use focused on increasing insulin production or providing exogenous insulin to drive down the symptom of high blood glucose? I think there are probably multiple explanations for that. One of them is obviously money. I mean, there are people who make a lot of money off of diabetes treatments. And if you think about it, if you develop a diabetes drug, you have a customer for life. And if you can get that drug on an insurance formulary, you've got a payee source. And it's a very, very lucrative situation. I think you cannot put all the blame on the pharmaceutical industry. I think as the consumer, that we need to take some of it too, because patients don't like to change their diet. We want When people say they want a simple solution, there is a simple solution, but what we're really saying is we want an easy solution and one that doesn't require change. And I say this in regards to myself as well, because changing diet is very difficult. Food is not something you can simply avoid, and it's a part of our family life and our traditions, and it's emotional and it's reassuring and it's a lot of good things. And it is very, very difficult to say you have to change how you're going to eat. But to me, I think of patients that I have had who get upset that I can't do a better job, for example, controlling their breathing difficulties and their COPD, but they have been unwilling or unable to quit smoking. And it is very easy for people to throw shade at those people and say how ridiculous it is and how lazy they are. But in reality, how different is that than the individual who wants me to give them pills to fix the diabetes, but is completely unwilling to change how they eat? It just doesn't make sense. The safest, most effective, and least expensive solution is to change how you eat. Now, interestingly, especially for those of us who grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s with this low fat craze, low fat is not the way to go. Even though fatty liver is part of this insulin resistance pattern, it's actually excess sugar that drives the accumulation of triglycerides in the liver that drives fatty liver. Lowering your fat is not the key. It's lowering your carbohydrate intake. And there are 4 types of diets that Dr. Fung reviews that have provided superior glycemic control when they have looked at studies. So they are very simply a low carb diet, a low glycemic index diet. And I'm a big fan of using the glycemic index to help with food decisions. A Mediterranean diet, which has been shown in studies to decrease the need for medication by 59%, and a high protein diet. There's obviously a lot of overlap there, and all of these diets share one common feature, and it's that they reduce dietary carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are a form of macronutrient. I've talked a lot about micronutrients, your vitamins and minerals and aminos, but macronutrients are basically carbs, proteins, and fat. And so all of those diets, even though it's kind of by different mechanisms and how they guide food choices, they're reducing dietary carbs. So, why that matters, a carbohydrate or a carb has the biggest impact on insulin load and blood sugar. So, the higher the intake of refined carbohydrates, the higher the risk of diabetes. So, what is a refined carbohydrate? Not all carbs are created equal. When something's refined, it's what it says. You took it from its form and nature, and you took out stuff, you changed it. You take out the natural fiber, fat, and proteins, and you leave these pure concentrated carbs that actually don't exist in nature and have a very detrimental impact. So, for example, if you take wheat and you take the wheat berry, first of all, if you take the hull off of it, you take the bran off, so it's like white, why we have white breads and things like that. You're taking out the natural fiber, fat, and protein. But then also when we grind things further to make flours, that increases the speed of digestion, which causes higher insulin spikes, higher glucose spikes first, which then leads to the higher insulin levels. So he quotes correspondence from Dr. David Unwin, who's been really successful in helping impact change with diet teaching. And Dr. Unwin says, and I quote, starchy foods like bread, cereals, rice, or potato are concentrated sugar digested into huge amounts of glucose. And there was even a British Medical Journal article that showed that sometimes bread, which can be this ultra refined carbohydrate, can have a greater impact on blood sugar than even table sugar does. And they call carbohydrates basically insulin hogs. So when you have carbohydrates, specifically refined carbohydrates, your body doesn't have to break them down because they have been broken down by another process. Then your body has to use huge amounts of insulin to basically take care of business. So why are proteins different than carbohydrates in their impact? So proteins are made of amino acid chains, and when your body digests them, it breaks them down into amino acids, and you do need some amount of insulin to metabolize them and for the liver to be able to break them down. However, you do not need nearly as much as you do with your refined carbohydrates. Fat is broken down into fatty acids, and you actually don't even need insulin to properly metabolize fat. So when we did what happened to this country and to other industrialized nations in the last 40, 50 years, where we said, okay, we're going to go on a low fat diet and then we're going to increase carbs. And we all remember things like the food pyramid that basically said, hey, your diet should be based on carbohydrates and really, really small amounts of fat and a little larger amounts of protein. But basically, as a carb rich diet, we were really setting the stage for this epidemic by what we were feeding people through regulation and teaching and education. We learned about that in school, and that was the best way to do things. And I was on that bandwagon. I wasn't all about the refined carbohydrates. I did use whole wheat bread and try to do those sorts of things. But you'll notice, even though we changed those recommendations, we had more obesity, more diabetes, more heart disease. And we've become obsessed and still, despite evidence, aren't letting go of some of these misnomers like dietary fat and cholesterol. When you think back to what I said a little bit earlier, how it's triglycerides that get stored in the liver and perpetuate fatty liver, not LDL. The biggest things that affect metabolic syndrome and that fatty liver cycle are having inadequate HDL, which is the good cholesterol, and high triglycerides. But this country has become obsessed with LDL and shoving statins down people's throats if they have even mildly, quote unquote, elevated LDL levels. We've addressed this in other episodes, but you don't want your LDL to be too low. Cholesterol is really important and protective for brain health and nerves and all sorts of different things. So we've kind of taken what's good for our bodies and flipped it on our heads. So Dr. Chung gives 3 rules for reversing type 2 diabetes. Number 1, avoid fructose. And he talks about basically you need to eliminate to the best extent possible added sugars from your diet. So you just look at your labels. The more processed something is, the higher risk there's added sugars. And you're looking not just for sugar, but for high fructose corn syrup and those sorts of things. So added sugars, not good. And I'm not an advocate of not celebrating your birthday or having any joy in your life, but just as a principle, this needs to be a very small amount of what we do. Then he says, hey, reduce refined carbohydrates, so the white flour, the white rice, potatoes, and enjoy natural fats, and then eat real food. So those are 3 things that most people can do without a lot of education or guidance. But if not enough, the key is fasting, intermittent fasting. And this is the bulk of what he talks about in this book. And it's the bulk of what we're going to talk about in our next episode. But I want to set the stage for that a little bit. Dr. Fung said it's the oldest dietary intervention known to humans. Its natural cleansing power has been harnessed by virtually all religions in the world. It's free and it can be done anywhere. What am I talking about? The power of fasting. It's more powerful and more sustainable than really calorie restricted diets, because when we restrict our calorie intake, that actually lowers our metabolism and causes weight gain. So you may have seen some of these what happened next sort of thing about the Biggest Loser, which was a big thing where people went on these ultra restricted diets, all this exercise, and some people would lose a ton of weight. But all of them, when they went back to just normal eating, not garbage eating, regained all the weight and have struggled and struggled. He references studies that show that a 40% reduction in calories is met with a 40% decrease in your basal metabolic rate, the rate at which you actually burn calories. But intermittent fasting, which is defined by having periods of time where you don't eat, fasting just means not eating. That's why breakfast is called breakfast, to break the fast. When you're sleeping, you're not eating. When you start eating again, you've ended your fast. And by doing some very basic things and extending that window during which you don't eat, you can have positive impacts on reversing fatty liver, reversing type 2 diabetes, weight loss, but even more importantly, losing visceral fat, that abdominal fat that is in and around the liver and pancreas and those organs. And he tells us why it's so successful, because it triggers numerous hormonal adaptations that do not happen with simple caloric restriction. Insulin drops sharply, preventing insulin resistance. Noradrenaline, which is a neurotransmitter, rises, which keeps your metabolism high. Growth hormone rises, maintaining lean mass, so you don't lose muscle. Now, if you, I don't know, have a computer or on the internet, you've probably seen things about intermittent fasting and what type of fasting you should do and what window you should use, how long, based on your body size or type, you should eat or not eat. I propose that simpler is better. So we're going to talk in our next episode to Brian Wiles, who's a chef who has incorporated these principles to reverse his diabetes and make some great improvements in his health and quality of life, and can help us understand how to do it. But I am all for not setting ourselves up for failure, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Say you read about someone who does an 18 or 20 hour fast a day, and that's just not sustainable for you. That's okay. Is maybe 16 sustainable for you? Even 14 may be a ton better than what you're doing now. Even by stopping eating after dinner and choosing what things you snack on and what types of food you build your diet around, you can have a positive impact on your health. Do not, in this or in any avenue of health, let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So stay tuned to hear Brian's success story, and remember to have hope, because you are made to be whole. Have a podcast question or suggestion? Text or call us on the podcast info line at 330-439-0686. Thank you for spending time with me today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to be notified when new episodes release. And remember, you were made to be whole.